My name is Leora Cavendish. Maybe that name means nothing to you yet, but it's carved into the marble foundation of the woman I've been forced to become. I was the disappointment, the fragile thread in a lineage of silver spoons and sharper tongues. Tonight was supposed to be like any other family dinner. Long, drawn out, suffocating with the scent of overcooked lamb and undercooked compassion. But I should have known better. This time, the air held a storm I hadn't felt before. I watched the rain pelt the window of my father's estate, the droplets tracing lines down the glass like they were weeping for me. My palms rested on my knees, my fingers tapping a rhythm I hadn't realized matched the pulse racing in my throat. My mother sat opposite me, flawless in her rigid perfection, her hair sprayed into submission like everything else she touched. "You should be grateful, Leora," she said, tilting her wine glass just enough to make the crystal catch the chandelier's glow. "Your brother has been offered a position at the firm, partner track, and here you are, still scribbling away in that little notebook of yours." The words slid down my spine like ice water. I swallowed, my tongue heavy with the bitterness I'd spent years pretending not to taste. They didn't understand that words were all I had sometimes, that the pages in my leather-bound journal were the only place I existed without apology. My father cleared his throat. He always did that when he was about to say something cruel and wanted to pretend it was reasonable. "Your mother's right. You're 27, Leora. And what do you have to show for it? You hop from job to job, city to city. You're a drifter. A failure." There it was. The word that clung to my chest like mold. Failure. I opened my mouth, but the words lodged behind my teeth like a prison door, refusing to budge. I glanced at my brother, Alden, who sat next to his fiancée. He didn't meet my eyes. He never did when they turned on me. He just cut into his lamb, chewing slowly, methodically, like none of this concerned him. "You know what your problem is, Leora?" My father pressed on, his voice rising above the rain. "You think life owes you something. But it doesn't. It never has. And until you learn that, you'll stay exactly where you are. Beneath us." A laugh caught in my throat, a jagged sound that startled everyone. "Beneath you?" I echoed. My hands trembled, but I curled my fingers into fists until the tremor subsided. "You think I want your approval? That I'm some lost child waiting for you to love me?" My mother's eyes narrowed, her lips pressed so tight they went white. "Watch your tone." "Why? What will you do? Cut me off? Kick me out? You've already done that 1,000 times, in 1,000 ways. You just didn't have the spine to make it physical." My father slammed his glass onto the table, shards of crystal skittering across the linen like tiny shooting stars. "You have no respect." I felt it then. The shift in the room, the way the walls seemed to close in. But what none of them noticed was the man standing by the door. Luca. My bodyguard. Or so the world thought. To me, he was more than that. He was the one person who saw me, who knew that I was more than their worthless disappointment. He stepped forward, his shoulders broad enough to block out the storm behind him. His voice was calm, but it rumbled with the promise of something unshakable. "Is there a problem here, Mr. Cavendish?" My father sneered, his face flushing crimson. "Stay out of family business, mister." Luca's eyes locked with mine. His jaw tightened, like he could taste my humiliation and wanted to swallow it whole on my behalf. He turned back to my parents, each word deliberate. "With all due respect, sir, you're speaking to her like she's nothing. I won't stand by and let that happen." A hush fell over the room. Even Alden paused, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth. My mother's voice was like the hiss of a snake. "You forget your place, young man. You're paid to stand there, not to speak." Luca took another step closer, his hand brushing mine under the table, a fleeting spark of warmth in this frozen mausoleum of love. "Then fire me," he said, his eyes never leaving my father's. "But I won't watch you break her. Not tonight." My heart thudded so loud I wondered if they could hear it. My parents looked at each other, their faces a mirror of disbelief and rage. I could see the calculation in their eyes, the realization that they'd lost control for a moment, and they hated it. I stood then, my chair scraping back like a battle cry. My voice felt like thunder in my chest. "If you think you can tear me down, you're wrong. I'm done living on my knees for you." The storm outside roared, thunder shaking the window panes. Luca turned slightly, angling his body as if to shield me from the lightning of my parents' fury. My father's lip curled. "If you walk out that door, don't come crawling back when the world chews you up." I stepped around the table, every inch of me buzzing with the defiance I'd buried for too long. I looked my mother straight in her cold, glassy eyes. You're right. The world is harsh. But I'd rather face it alone than stay here and drown in your poison. Luca's hand found mine. Firm, steady, the only anchor I needed. Together, we turned toward the massive oak doors at the end of the dining room. Leora. My father's voice stopped me at the threshold. I didn't look back, but I felt his words slicing at my back like a knife. You'll regret this. I didn't respond. I didn't have to. I knew the world outside was waiting, cruel and vast. But it was mine now. Not theirs. As Luca pulled the door open, the wind and rain rushed in, washing over us like baptism. And in that storm, for the first time in my life, I felt free. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. The cold hit me first, a slap of rain and wind that felt like the truth itself. Raw, cleansing, relentless. Luca's hand was still wrapped around mine, our fingers threaded like a promise we hadn't spoken aloud yet. Behind us, the Cavendish mansion glowed like a prison made of stained glass and gilded cruelty. I didn't look back. Not once. We ran to the car parked at the bottom of the winding gravel drive. The tires hissed on the wet stones as Luca pulled the door open for me. I hesitated. Just for a second, the weight of what I'd done pressing down on me like the sky itself. But then I saw my reflection in the rain-spattered window, hair plastered to my cheeks, eyes wide and wild, and I knew I could never go back. I climbed in. The leather seat was cold against my soaked dress, but I barely felt it over the thrum of my heartbeat. Luca slid behind the wheel, glancing at me with that steady, unwavering gaze. The engine rumbled to life. We drove through the gates like we were breaking free of a curse. Where to? He asked. His voice was calm, but I could hear the undercurrent of worry threading through it. He was worried about me, about what came next, maybe about what lines he'd just crossed. I stared out the window. The Cavendish estate grew smaller and smaller in the side mirror, swallowed by the night. Anywhere. Everywhere. I don't care, Luca. Just drive. He did. We drove for hours, the rain chasing us across country lanes and empty highways. My phone buzzed again and again in my purse. Calls from my mother, my father, Alden, numbers I didn't recognize. I turned it off and tossed it onto the dashboard. The silence in the car wrapped around us, heavy but alive with the words we hadn't said yet. Do you want to talk about it? Luca asked after a while. He kept his eyes on the road, but I could feel the way he watched me out of the corner of his eye. Like I was breakable glass. He was determined not to drop. I shook my head. Not yet. The truth was, I didn't know how to talk about it. How do you explain a lifetime of invisible cuts and call it a story? How do you wrap up decades of being told you're nothing into a neat little package of sentences? We stopped at a roadside diner just before dawn, one of those places with neon signs that flicker and crackle, like they're barely clinging to life. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee and stale fries, but it was warm and there were people who didn't know my name. That was enough. I sank into a booth by the window while Luca ordered 2 mugs of coffee. He sat across from me, his broad shoulders filling the tiny space, his presence anchoring me to something real. Leora, he said gently. What happens now? I stared into my coffee cup, the steam curling up like ghosts. I don't know. I spent so long living in that house, trying to be what they wanted, trying to be small enough not to disappoint them. And now that I'm out, I feel like I should have a plan. But I don't. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing mine. The touch was soft, but it sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. You don't have to have a plan right now. You just have to breathe. One breath at a time. I looked up at him, at the scar near his temple that I'd always wondered about, but never had the courage to ask. The things he'd done for me, the way he'd protected me from the shadows of my family's cruelty, it was more than I'd ever let myself hope for. Why did you do it? I asked. Why speak up? You could lose your job. He didn't flinch, didn't look away. Because someone had to remind you that you're worth defending. I swallowed hard, my eyes burning. For a moment, the clatter of forks and muttered conversations around us faded. It was just him and me, the quiet promise of something new trembling between us. When we left the diner, the sky was lightening at the edges. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world scrubbed raw and clean. Luca drove us to a small hotel near the city. It wasn't fancy, faded carpets, peeling wallpaper, but it had a lock on the door and a bed that wasn't mine or theirs. I took a long shower, scrubbing the scent of my mother's perfume and my father's disappointment from my skin. When I stepped out, wrapped in a threadbare towel, Luca was sitting on the edge of the bed, scrolling through his phone. He looked up, his eyes softening when they met mine. "You okay?" I nodded. "I will be." He stood, moving closer until he was right in front of me. For a heartbeat, I thought he might pull me into his arms, and I wasn't sure if I'd let him. But he didn't. He just rested his hand on my shoulder, grounding me. "You don't owe them anything, Leora. Not your tears, not your apologies, nothing." "I know." But I didn't. Not yet. Knowing and believing are two very different things. I lay awake most of that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of Luca's breathing in the next room. He'd refused to sleep beside me, insisting I needed space. Maybe he was right. Maybe we both did. In the morning, I woke to find a note on the nightstand in his handwriting. "Out for a quick run. Breakfast on the way back. Lock the door." I smiled. Even now, he was still protecting me from the world. Or maybe from myself. When he returned, he brought coffee and a paper bag with pastries that tasted better than any of the 5-star meals I'd grown up pretending to enjoy. We sat on the floor, our backs against the bed, legs stretched out in front of us. "So," he said, tearing off a piece of his croissant, "what do you want, Leora? Not what your parents want, not what you think you should want. Just you." The question rattled something deep in my chest. I wanted a lot of things. I wanted to write without being mocked. I wanted to breathe without feeling like I had to apologize for existing. I wanted to stand up in a room full of people and not shrink into the wallpaper. "I want to be free," I said finally. "I want to prove that they're wrong about me. That I'm not a failure." "Good." His smile was soft but fierce. "Then that's what we'll do." I arched an eyebrow. "We?" Luca shrugged, popping the rest of the pastry into his mouth. "You're not getting rid of me that easily, Cavendish." For the first time in what felt like years, I laughed. It wasn't bitter or forced. It bubbled up from somewhere new, somewhere hopeful. But reality caught up with us faster than I wanted it to. By noon, my phone was vibrating again. I turned it on to see a flood of messages. Some from my family, others from numbers I didn't recognize. There was a voicemail from Alden. "Leora, please. They're furious. You need to come back and apologize. Just do it for Dad's sake. Asterisk." I played it twice, each word sinking its claws into the soft parts of me. Luca watched me, his jaw tightening. "You're not going back," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement carved in stone. I know. But did I? The doubt whispered, weaving itself around my resolve like a noose. What if they were right? What if the world chewed me up and spit me out just like they said it would? The knock on the door came before I could answer the questions clawing at my brain. Lucas stood, his whole body tensing. He pressed a finger to his lips, then moved to the peephole. "It's Alden," he whispered. My heart lurched. "Let him in." Luca hesitated, then unlocked the door. My brother stepped in, rain dripping from the shoulders of his expensive suit. He looked out of place in this rundown room, like a golden boy who'd wandered into a nightmare he couldn't quite understand. "Leora," he said, his voice hoarse. "What are you doing? You can't just disappear. Do you know what you've done to them? To all of us?" I crossed my arms over my chest, the towel slipping slightly. "I've done what I should have done years ago. I left." Alden's eyes darted to Luca, standing protectively behind me. "Is this him? The muscle? The reason you're acting out?" Luca bristled, but I placed a hand on his arm. "Don't. He's just repeating what they fed him." Alden stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Please, Leora, come back. Dad will forgive you if you just apologize. Say you were emotional. Say you didn't mean it." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I meant every word." His shoulders slumped, defeat seeping into his perfect posture. "Then what do you want me to tell them?" I took a deep breath, my pulse steady for the first time in days. "Tell them I'm done. Tell them I'm not coming back. Ever. Alden looked at me like he didn't recognize me. Maybe he didn't. Maybe this was the first time he'd seen me at all. He turned to leave but paused at the door. They'll come for you, you know. They don't let go. Not ever. Luca stepped forward, his hand closing around the door handle. Let them try. Alden's eyes flicked to me one last time before he slipped into the hallway, the door clicking shut behind him. I stood there, the sound of my brother's footsteps fading. Luca's hand found mine again, warm and certain. Outside, the storm was building again, thunder rumbling in the distance like a warning. But I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Somewhere deep in my chest, the fire they tried so hard to snuff out burned brighter than ever. And I knew this was just the beginning. The silence after Alden's footsteps faded was a living thing. It crawled up the walls of the cheap hotel room and coiled itself around my throat. I could feel it pressing at the edges of my resolve, testing for cracks. Luca stood beside me, his hand still wrapped around mine, like he could sense every tremor beneath my skin. Outside, the rain came in steady sheets, hammering against the grimy window, as if the storm had decided to move in permanently. I sank onto the bed, the springs creaking under my weight. My damp hair clung to the back of my neck, a reminder of the world we'd run from. The world that, in all its cruelty, was still trying to follow me here. Luca crouched in front of me, his hands resting on my knees. He waited until I met his eyes, dark and steady, a calm harbor in the churning sea of my thoughts. He's right, you know, I whispered. They won't let go. He didn't flinch, didn't look away. Then, we'll make them. His certainty almost made me laugh. Almost. Instead, I shook my head, trying to wrap my arms around the enormity of it all. You don't understand, Luca. They have money, influence. They have ways of making you feel like you have no right to breathe without their permission. I know exactly what they have, he said, his voice like steel wrapped in velvet, but I also know what you have. My breath hitched. What's that? He leaned closer, so close, I could feel the warmth radiating off him. You have me. It should have terrified me, how much I needed that. But it didn't. Not anymore. Not with him. He stood and went to the rickety dresser where his duffel bag sat, half-zipped. He pulled out a small black box and handed it to me. My hands shook as I flipped it open. A new phone. Smash the old one, he said. Start fresh. New number, new everything. They can't follow what they can't find. I stared at the sleek rectangle of glass and metal, so small, so ordinary. But in that moment, it felt like a key. I set it down and picked up my old phone, tracing my thumb over the cracks in the screen. Each one felt like a scar, proof of every time I tried to break free and failed. This time, I wouldn't fail. I stood, crossed the room, and dropped it into the bathroom sink. Luca handed me a hammer. God only knows where he'd stashed that. And I brought it down, once, twice, until the screen was nothing but shards and dust. Each blow felt like ripping a piece of their hold off my skin. When it was done, I looked at myself in the cracked mirror. My reflection stared back. Wild hair, raw eyes, a thin line of blood trickling from a scratch on my palm. I didn't look like the Leora Cavendish they'd tried to mold. I looked like someone they'd never really known. Now what? I asked, turning to Luca. The hammer hung from my fingertips like an exclamation point I wasn't ready to put down. He took it from me, set it aside. Now we disappear for a while. I've got a place, off the grid, safe. I almost asked him how I could trust that. But then I realized, trust wasn't the problem. Believing I deserved the safety he was offering, that was the real fight. He booked the room for one more night. Neither of us slept. I lay on my side, facing the door, listening to the low rumble of his breathing from the chair he refused to leave. Each time the floor creaked or the pipes rattled, his eyes snapped open, searching the darkness for threats only he could sense. By dawn, my eyelids felt like sandpaper, but I didn't care. For the first time in my life, I wasn't counting the hours until morning, because I dreaded what it would bring. I was counting them because I couldn't wait to see what I'd do with them. We left before the sun was fully up, carrying nothing but one bag each. Luca paid in cash. He'd made me stash my family's credit cards at the bottom of a trash bin outside the diner where we'd stopped days ago. It felt good to think of them rotting in the dark, useless. The drive was long, winding north along empty highways that felt like veins pumping us away from everything I used to be. The city faded behind us like a bad dream. I dozed off once, my head lolling against the window, and woke to Luca's coat draped over my shoulders. He glanced at me, his hand steady on the wheel, and I wondered if he'd ever let himself rest. We stopped at a gas station near the state line. Luca filled the tank while I stood by the vending machine, staring at rows of candy bars and chips like they were relics from another life. A man came in behind me, middle-aged, balding, a suit wrinkled from hours behind a desk. He smelled like stale cologne and regret. "Hey there," he said, his voice greasy with something that made my skin crawl. "You all right, sweetheart? You look lost." I stiffened. Old habits die hard. Smile, nod, make yourself small, so you don't invite more attention than you can handle. But then I remembered the hammer, the smashed phone, the feel of Luca's hand in mine when we'd walked out of that house. I turned to the man, let my eyes harden. "I'm exactly where I need to be." His smirk faltered. Before he could say anything else, Luca appeared at my shoulder, tall and silent as a shadow. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The man mumbled something and shuffled out, the bell over the door jingling like a nervous laugh. I grabbed a bag of pretzels and a bottle of water, tossing them onto the counter. Luca paid, eyes scanning the parking lot through the grimy window. "You didn't have to do that," I said as we walked back to the car. "I know," he said, "but I wanted to." Hours passed like that, stretches of silence broken by snippets of conversation. He told me about the safe house, how he'd found it through an old contact from before he became my shadow. I didn't press him for details. Some parts of him were walled off, just like some parts of me. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun had dipped behind the trees, casting everything in a bruised twilight. It was small, tucked into a clearing surrounded by pine and oak, the kind of place where the world couldn't find you if it tried. Inside, it smelled of cedar and old books. There was a fireplace, a battered sofa, a bed pushed into the corner, a tiny kitchen stocked with canned goods, and a single bag of coffee beans. Luca dropped his bag by the door and turned to me. "It's not much, but it's safe." "It's perfect," I said, and I meant it. I spent that first night curled up on the sofa, staring into the cold ashes of the fireplace, listening to the wind whistle through the trees. I thought about Alden's words. "They'll come for you. They don't let go." Good, let them try. I woke before dawn to the sound of Luca chopping wood outside. Through the window, I saw him. Shirt sleeves rolled up, sweat glistening on his arms despite the cold. Each swing of the axe was like a vow. I will keep her safe. I will not let them break her again. The days blurred into one another. I found an old typewriter in the corner of the cabin, its keys sticky but functional. I started writing, nothing special, just pieces of myself I hadn't dared to put into words before. Each click of the keys felt like stitching wounds I'd carried for too long. Sometimes Luca would read over my shoulder. He never asked questions, never offered advice. Just stood there, close enough that I could feel the heat of him. And when I'd get stuck, he'd squeeze my shoulder like he was telling me, "Keep going, you're almost there." We fell into a rhythm. He cooked, simple meals that tasted like freedom. I wrote. We took walks through the woods, our breath misting in the cold air, our laughter echoing through the trees like something we'd stolen from a better world. One night, a week after we arrived, I woke to find him sitting by the window, his silhouette carved out by moonlight. I padded over, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders. "Can't sleep?" I asked. He shrugged, his eyes fixed on the darkness outside. "Old habits." I sat beside him, our knees brushing. "You're worried they'll find us." He didn't answer. He didn't have to. I reached for his hand. He let me take it, his fingers curling around mine like a lifeline. "They won't break me again, Luca," I whispered. "I won't let them." His grip tightened. "I know. In that tiny cabin, in the middle of nowhere, we made a promise without speaking it aloud. We would survive this. Together. But deep down, I knew the storm was only waiting for us to let our guard down." And when it came, it would try to tear everything we'd built apart. He turned to face me then, his eyes dark and stormy. They put out a notice. Private investigator. They're offering money for anyone who can tell them where you are. I felt the world tilt. My breath came in short, sharp gasps. How close? Not close yet. He reached for me, but I stepped back. I couldn't bear to be touched right then. Leora, I need air, I snapped, grabbing my coat from the hook by the door. I stepped outside before he could stop me. The cold hit me like a slap. I stumbled down the porch steps, boots crunching on frostbitten grass. I didn't care where I went. I just needed to move, to outrun the fear rising in my throat. I didn't hear him follow until his voice cut through the dark. Stop! I spun around. He stood at the edge of the porch, the light from the window casting his shadow long across the yard. You think running will help? He demanded. I don't know, my voice cracked. I don't know what I'm doing, Luca. I don't know who I am without them hating me. His boots crunched closer. You're Leora Cavendish. You're the woman who walked out of that house and never looked back. But what if they're right? The words spilled out, raw and ugly. What if I am a failure? What if I can't do this? He closed the distance between us, his hands gripping my shoulders. Then we fail together. But we don't give up. Not ever. I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to. But the weight of my parents' voices pressed against my ribs like iron bars. He tilted my chin up, forcing me to meet his eyes. You are not them, Leora. You never were. I didn't realize I was crying until he brushed his thumb across my cheek, wiping the tears away like they were nothing. The next day, the snow came. Thick, heavy flakes that turned the forest into a world of white and silence. Luca chopped more wood. I wrote for hours, pages spilling out of me like I'd torn open a dam. I didn't know if the words were any good. I didn't care. They were mine. One night, I woke to the sound of tires on the gravel drive. My heart slammed against my ribs. Luca was already on his feet, gun in hand. He peered through the curtain, his breath fogging the glass. It's a car, he said, voice low. One man. Alone. I felt like a child again. Helpless, small, waiting for the axe to fall. But I forced myself to stand beside him. The man who stepped out of the car was older, with a gray beard and a long coat. He didn't look dangerous, but I'd learned not to trust appearances. Luca opened the door a crack. Can I help you? The man held up his hands, palms out. Name's Callahan. I'm a friend. Luca didn't move. Whose friend? Callahan's eyes flicked to me. Hers. My breath caught. I don't know you. He nodded. No, but I knew your grandfather. The real Cavendish, not the monster who wears his name now. I stepped forward, my pulse pounding. What do you want? Same thing you do, Callahan said, his voice low. To see them fall. Behind me, Luca stiffened. What are you talking about? Callahan glanced at him. You know what they're into, don't you? Your father's not just cruel, Leora. He's dirty. Dirty money, dirty deals. All of it. And if you want to be free, you need to hit him where it hurts. My stomach twisted. Why should I trust you? Callahan stepped closer, the porch light casting shadows across his weathered face. Because your grandfather trusted me. And because your father's people are close. Closer than you think. You stay here, you're a sitting duck. Luca's hand hovered near his gun. You expect us to just run again? Callahan's eyes met mine, unwavering. Not run, fight. I looked at Luca. He looked at me. And for the first time, I saw the fire in his eyes reflected back in mine. My parents wanted me small. They wanted me silent. Invisible. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to become the storm they'd always feared I could be. And I knew then. This wasn't the end of my story. It was only the beginning of my war. Callahan's eyes were sharp in the dim light spilling from the cabin door, flickering over my face like he was searching for something. Proof, maybe, that I had enough steel in me to finish what he was about to start. Luca didn't move from my side, his hand still hovering near his gun, but there was something in his stance that told me he'd follow my lead no matter what I chose. I took a breath that tasted like wood smoke and pine needles. "If you know so much about my father, why come to me now?" I asked. My voice was steady, though I could feel my pulse hammering against the base of my throat. Callahan's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Because you're the one thing he didn't plan for. You're not bought. You're not controlled. You walked away. That scares him more than you think." Behind me, Luca's voice was low, dark. "You said we're sitting ducks. Who's close?" Callahan shifted, glancing out at the tree line like he half expected something to slither out of the shadows. "They've got eyes in the nearest town. Probably watching the main roads, gas stations, diners. They don't know about me. Not yet. But if you stay here, they'll find you." Luca bristled. "You could be leading us into a trap." "I could," Callahan agreed without flinching. "But ask yourself, how long do you think you can hide? If you want to be free, you've got to make him bleed. Money, reputation, pride. Take all of it." I felt the fear clawing at the edges of my mind, but beneath it was something else. Something older. Older than the Cavendish name. Older than my mother's cold hands or my father's biting words. Anger. Righteous, burning anger. I looked at Luca. "What do you think?" He didn't answer right away. He just stared at me, his jaw tight, like he was memorizing my face before the world tried to break me again. Then he nodded. "If you want to fight, we fight." Callahan let out a slow breath, like he'd been waiting for that. "Good. Packlight. I know a place we can lay low and plan. And Leora?" "Yeah." He leaned closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear. "You've got your grandfather's fire. Don't waste it." We left the cabin that night. I didn't look back at the place that had become a refuge, a cocoon for a version of myself that no longer needed hiding. I climbed into the back seat of Callahan's battered SUV, Luca beside me, his arm brushing mine as we buckled in. The road wound through the forest like a vein, and in the darkness I felt that old fear trying to wrap itself around me again. But Luca's hand found mine, and I held on. I held on to him and to the promise I'd made to myself when I smashed that phone. I would not let them decide who I was anymore. Callahan drove for hours. He didn't speak much, only muttering directions under his breath and glancing at the rearview mirror like he expected ghosts to materialize out of the night. When dawn finally broke, it was through a gray drizzle that turned the world soft and cold. He pulled up to an old farmhouse nestled in the hills. The paint peeled in long strips, and the barn out back leaned like a drunk old man. But the windows were dark, the driveway empty. It felt forgotten. Safe enough for now. Inside, the place smelled of dust and old wood. There were boxes stacked in the corners, yellowed newspapers, and faded photographs of people whose eyes seemed to follow me as I walked through the rooms. "Who owns this place?" Luca asked, dropping our bags near the door. "Belonged to a friend," Callahan said. "He owed me. He's dead now, so he can't argue." I shivered, but didn't argue. We settled in as best we could. Luca checked every window, every lock, then every window again. I sat at the rickety kitchen table with Callahan, who spread out a stack of files and photos that looked like they'd been dragged through a hurricane. "These are your father's shell companies," he said, tapping a photo of an office building I recognized from my childhood. "This one's in the Caymans. This one in Zurich. You'd be amazed how much filth is hidden behind those stone facades." I stared at the pictures, at the bank statements with numbers that made my head spin. "And what do you expect me to do with all this?" He looked at me like I'd missed the obvious. "Blow it up, leak it, burn it all to the ground. You want to be free? You cut out the rot." I felt Luca's eyes on me, but I didn't look up. I traced my finger over the name Cavendish scrawled across one of the documents, my breath shaking. "If I do this, he'll come after me harder. He'll ruin me." Callahan leaned back, folding his arms. "He's already ruined you. Only difference now is you get to decide what you look like when you rise from the ashes." A silence settled over the room, heavy as a tomb. Luca spoke first. "How do we leak it without getting caught?" Callahan's eyes twinkled. Already working on it. But you'll need to be ready to run, fast, when this hits the light. And you? He turned to me, his gaze pinning me to my chair. You need to decide how far you're willing to go. I didn't answer him then, not because I didn't know, but because I did. We spent the next week living like ghosts. Callahan taught me how to move money, how to send encrypted messages, how to use burner phones and hide my tracks. Luca drilled me on what to do if we got separated. There were moments when I caught him staring at me across the kitchen table, his eyes dark with something I couldn't name. One night after Callahan had fallen asleep in the armchair, Luca and I sat on the floor in front of the fireplace. He poked at the dying embers with an old iron rod. You sure about this? He asked. No. I pulled my knees to my chest. But I'm more sure than I've ever been about anything else. He leaned back against the couch, his head tipping up to look at the cracked ceiling. You're brave, Leora. I snorted. I'm terrified. He reached out, brushing his fingers against my wrist. Brave people always are. I didn't sleep much that night. My mind raced with what came next. But for the first time, the fear didn't paralyze me. It sharpened me. It made me ready. The leak went out at dawn 3 days later. A journalist friend of Callahan's met us in a diner on the outskirts of a nowhere town. We handed over everything. Files, photos, bank records. Proof of every dirty deal my father had ever hidden under the Cavendish name. When we stepped back into the parking lot, the air smelled like rain. Luca stood so close I could feel the heat of him at my back. They'll know it was you, he said. I hope they do, I whispered. That night, the world found out who my father really was. Headlines screamed about fraud, offshore accounts, bribery. His face was everywhere, on TV screens, splashed across newspapers, on the lips of people who'd once bowed at his feet. The calls started before sunrise. My mother, Alden. Unknown numbers that rang and rang until I smashed my burner phone against the wall. Callahan found me sitting on the porch steps at dawn, my hands shaking. You did it, he said. For now, I murmured. He crouched beside me. They'll come for you harder than ever. You ready? I looked at the horizon, where the sun was trying to claw its way through the clouds. I was born ready. I just didn't know it. Luca stepped outside, his shadow falling over me. He offered me his hand, and I took it without hesitation. Behind us, the farmhouse felt less like a hiding place and more like a launch pad. I wasn't running anymore. I was moving forward. And there was a difference. We didn't speak as we loaded up the SUV. We didn't have to. The war had begun, and this time, I was the one swinging the hammer. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. We left the farmhouse before dawn. The headlines were already out there, splashed across every major outlet, and whispered through the halls of the people who used to toast my father's name over aged whiskey and whispered deals. Now they were dragging that name through the dirt, clawing at it like vultures around a carcass. I should have felt triumph. I did, in a way. But it was buried beneath a weight that settled on my shoulders as we drove down winding back roads, the trees on either side clawing at the dawn light. Luca was at the wheel, Callahan dozing in the back seat with an old blanket pulled up to his chin. I stared at the side mirror, half expecting to see headlights chasing us, but the road behind us was empty. Are you okay? Luca's voice cut through the quiet. He hadn't looked at me, but his knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Define okay? His mouth twitched, almost a smile. Almost. You did it, Leora. You started it. I know. I turned back to the window. But they're not done with me yet. He didn't argue. He didn't tell me I was wrong. That was what I loved most about him, though I hadn't said the words aloud yet. He never fed me lies to make me feel better. He believed I could handle the truth. We drove for hours, stopping only when we reached an abandoned warehouse at the edge of an industrial district. Callahan knew someone, a friend of a friend who owed him a favor. The warehouse was cold, musty, and smelled faintly of old oil and rust. But it had a back door that locked from the inside and no one around for miles. Inside, we set up camp like we'd done it 100 times before. Luca checked every corner twice, then 3 times. Callahan spread out his maps and folders on an old metal workbench. I paced. My fingers itched for my notebook, but the words weren't ready to come yet. Callahan looked up at me. You ever think about what happens after? After what? I asked too sharply. He didn't flinch. After they're gone. After you win. I laughed. A short, brittle sound. Is that what you think this is? Winning? He tilted his head. You've already won more than you know. You just haven't felt it yet. Luca came up behind me, his hand brushing the small of my back. You should rest. I can't. I stepped away, needing the space. Needing to keep moving. If I close my eyes, I'll see him. I'll hear him. You want to hit him again? Callahan asked. Because I've got more. I stopped pacing. What do you mean? He reached for a battered envelope tucked into his jacket. There's another layer. Offshore accounts are one thing. But the real rot? It's here. The shell companies are tied to local contractors, politicians, charities. Fake ones, of course. But the money's real. I took the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were photos, paper trails, invoices, signatures I recognized. My father's. Alden's. Even my mother's neat cursive on a fake charity check. My stomach twisted. Callahan's voice dropped. You exposed this, and you're not just pulling down your father. You're pulling the whole rotten tree up by its roots. The weight of it pressed against my chest. I'll do it. Luca's hand closed around my wrist. Leora. I'll do it, I repeated. They won't stop until they're exposed, every last one of them. Callahan's grin was wolfish. That's my girl. We spent the night planning. By dawn, my eyes burned from the glow of the old desk lamp. Luca sat beside me, his warmth a tether, every time my mind drifted too close to panic. Callahan mapped out every account, every transaction, every name that would fall like dominoes once we made the next leak. Tomorrow, I said when the sun broke through the grime-streaked windows. Tomorrow, we hit them again. Luca drove us into the city that afternoon. I hadn't set foot in the city since I'd fled that dinner table, but the streets looked different now, like I was seeing the cracks I'd been blind to before. The skyscrapers that once felt like monuments to my family's power now seemed hollow, empty towers waiting to fall. We parked 2 blocks from a rundown internet cafe. Callahan swore was safe. I slipped inside, the air thick with old cigarette smoke and the stale hum of ancient computers. Luca waited by the door, eyes scanning every face. I sat at the far corner, plugging in the flash drive Callahan had prepared. My hands didn't shake. Not anymore. When I clicked send, it was like breathing for the first time. One by one, the files flew out into the void. Emails to journalists, encrypted packets to watchdog groups, leaks to the corners of the internet that fed on dirty secrets. When I stood, I felt taller than I ever had in my parents' house. Back at the warehouse, we watched the fallout unfold on an old TV perched on a stack of cinder blocks. The news anchors stuttered over words like embezzlement and conspiracy and corruption. Faces that had once smiled at my parents' parties were now framed by mugshots. Luca's arm slid around my shoulders. You did it. I leaned into him just for a moment. Not yet, but soon. We moved again that night. Callahan's contacts were starting to go dark, and that meant it was only a matter of time before the people my father had protected came hunting for someone to blame. We drove west, into the mountains, where the roads narrowed and the trees pressed close enough to swallow us whole. We found another safe house. This one a cabin so deep in the pines that even the stars felt out of reach. Inside, Luca built a fire while I stood by the window, watching the woods for any sign of headlights. My reflection in the glass startled me. My eyes looked older, sharper. I wondered if my parents would recognize me now. Luca came up behind me, slipping his arms around my waist. You're shaking. I know. He rested his chin on my shoulder. What are you thinking? That maybe I'm not scared enough. He turned me to face him, his hands cupping my jaw. You're allowed to be scared, Leora. You're allowed to feel everything. I closed my eyes, letting his warmth seep into the cracks. I just want it to end. It will. And when it does, his lips brushed my forehead. You'll still be standing. I fell asleep in his arms that night, the fire crackling low, but dreams of my father's voice found me anyway. Dark, heavy, coiling around my throat. I woke before dawn, sweat slick on my skin. Lucas stirred but didn't wake. I stepped outside into the cold mountain air, letting it bite at my cheeks, reminding me I was real. In the distance, I saw a figure moving through the trees. I froze, heart hammering, But when it stepped into the moonlight, it was Callahan, shoulders hunched, breath clouding the air. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked. He shook his head. "Never could when the hunt was close." "What do you mean?" He turned, his eyes hard. "They're not going to stop. Not now, you've cut too deep. Your father's lost face, lost money, lost power. The only thing he has left is revenge." I crossed my arms, hugging myself against the cold. "So what do we do?" Callahan stepped closer. "You finish it. You go home." I laughed, the sound bitter. "Home? That's not my home." "It's where the fight ends," he said. "You stand in front of him and you make him see you. You make him look you in the eye when he falls." I looked past him into the shadows of the trees that had hidden me so well. The thought of stepping back into that house made bile rise in my throat. But another part of me, the part that had written her name into the storm, wanted it, needed it. Behind me, I heard Luca's footsteps crunching in the snow. He stopped at my side, his hand finding mine without a word. "You want to go back?" he asked. I didn't answer him then. I didn't have to. He could see it in my eyes. A storm was coming, and this time, I would be its heart. The snow was falling in thick, quiet sheets when we decided to move. It clung to my boots and hair as I stood at the edge of the tree line, staring out at the narrow mountain road that would carry us back to the world I had tried so hard to escape. Luca stood beside me, his breath clouding the air, his gloved hand a steady anchor at my back. Callahan crouched near the SUV, checking the tires, his shoulders hunched against the cold. He looked older in the dawn light, lines carved deeper into his face, but there was something almost boyish in the glint of his eyes when he looked up at me. "You're sure about this?" he asked. It wasn't the first time he'd said it. He'd asked the same question over breakfast, over the maps spread across the kitchen table, over the brittle silence that had filled the cabin once we realized hiding was no longer enough. "I'm sure," I said, though my voice trembled. "I can't run anymore. If I do, I'll be running for the rest of my life." Luca shifted closer, his shoulder brushing mine. "We don't let you face him alone. Not ever." A lump formed in my throat, but I forced it down. "I know." We drove down the mountain in silence, the SUV's tires crunching through the fresh snow, each turn of the road carrying me deeper into memories I hadn't let myself revisit in months. The Cavendish estate sat on the outskirts of the city, like an old ghost waiting to drag me back under. Its wrought iron gates, the endless gravel drive, the marble columns that rose from the earth like tombstones. Every inch of it was a monument to a legacy built on lies. I'd once imagined that walking away would be the hardest thing I'd ever do. I was wrong. Coming back, choosing to walk through those gates with my eyes wide open, was the true act of defiance. Callahan parked the SUV a mile from the gate. He turned in his seat, his eyes finding mine in the rearview mirror. "Last chance to turn back." I shook my head. "If I turn back now, I lose everything I've fought for." He gave a small nod, then looked at Luca. "You ready?" Luca's answer was a silent one. He reached over, squeezed my hand, then stepped out into the snow, his boots sinking into the drifts. I followed him, my breath catching in my chest as the cold bit at my face. The walk to the gates felt longer than it should have. Each step was a prayer, and a curse rolled into one. My father's voice echoed in my head with every crunch of snow. "You're nothing. You're weak. You'll come crawling back." Not this time. We reached the gates just as the sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the drive. The security cameras turned toward us like glass eyes, watching, judging. I lifted my chin and stared right into them. Callahan stood a few feet behind, his hands buried in his coat pockets, his eyes sweeping the tree line. Luca stepped closer to me, his breath warm against my ear. "Ready?" "More than ready." I pressed the intercom button. My voice was steady, clear. "It's Leora. Tell my father I'm home." A beat of static, then a clipped voice I didn't recognize. "Miss Cavendish." "Tell him," I repeated, my fingers curling into fists at my sides. Or I'll walk through this gate and up the drive and make sure the whole world knows he's too much of a coward to face me. Another crackle of static. Then silence. Minutes later, the gates shuddered open, the iron groaning like old bones. I stepped forward, Luca at my side. Callahan a silent shadow behind us. Each step up the drive felt like dragging a chain behind me, years of secrets and shame clawing at my heels. But I didn't stop. The front doors swung open before we reached them, and there he was. My father stood in the doorway, flanked by two of his new security men. He looked smaller than I remembered, though his eyes still held that same cold fire that had once frozen me in place with a single glance. "Leora," he said, his voice smooth as silk over gravel. "What an unexpected surprise." I laughed, sharp, humorless. "You always hated surprises." His eyes flicked to Luca, then to Callahan. His lip curled. "Bringing strays home, I see." "They're more family to me than you ever were," I shot back. He stepped aside, gesturing toward the marble foyer. "Come in then. Let's talk like civilized people." I didn't move. "No games, Father. No lies. I'm here to end this." A flicker of annoyance crossed his face before he smoothed it away. "You always were dramatic." "Is that what you tell yourself when the headlines come for you?" I asked. "That I'm just your dramatic daughter? Your failure who didn't know her place?" His eyes narrowed. "You think you've won something? You've only made enemies you can't begin to understand." Luca stepped forward, his voice a low growl. "Try us." One of the guards shifted, his hand hovering near his holster. Callahan moved closer to me, his coat parting just enough for the glint of his own weapon to show. The guard froze. My father's smile didn't reach his eyes. "What do you want, Leora?" I took a step closer, the words burning in my chest. "I want the truth. I want every shell company, every dirty deal, every piece of you dragged into the light. And I want you to look me in the eye when you lose everything." His laugh was a dark, ugly sound. "You think you can destroy me? I built this family. I made you." "No," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You tried to break me, but you didn't make me. I did that myself." The foyer fell silent. The storm outside had faded, leaving only the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. He took a step closer, his voice dropping. "You want to play at being powerful, little girl? You'll learn what it means to crawl when the world turns on you." Luca shifted, ready to move, but I lifted a hand to stop him. "No, let him talk. Let him show me exactly what he is." My father's eyes glittered. "You always thought you were better than this family. But you're nothing without our name. Without my money." Callahan's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "She's about to prove you wrong." My father's gaze snapped to him. "Who the hell are you?" Callahan stepped forward, his grin wolfish. "The man who's been waiting 20 years to watch you fall." The front door swung wider, letting the cold rush in as headlights flickered at the end of the drive. Cars. More than one. Engines idling like hungry dogs. My father's eyes darted past me, calculating. For the first time, I saw it. The crack in his armor. The fear. He masked it quickly, but it was there. "You think you can run this show?" he snarled. "You think the people behind me will let you take it all?" I lifted my chin. "They're not behind you anymore." As if on cue, Callahan's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and held it up for me to see. One message. One line that told me everything. "It's done. The final files. The final names. Sent to every outlet, every lawyer, every watchdog who would sink their teeth in and never let go." There was no saving him now. No saving any of them. My father lunged. Luca stepped forward in an instant, intercepting him, one arm pinning him back with an ease that made the guards flinch. My father thrashed, his voice a roar that bounced off the marble walls. "You ungrateful little bitch. You think you can stand above me? I made you. I step closer, my face inches from his. No, you made this. And now you get to live in it. For a heartbeat, it was just us. Father and daughter. Monster and storm. Then I stepped back, watching him sag in Luca's grip, his eyes darting around for allies that weren't there anymore. The guards stood frozen. Callahan's grin widened. I turned away, my legs trembling. Luca's arm found my shoulders as we stepped back into the cold. The dawn light was breaking over the estate, the snow glittering like glass. Behind me, I heard my father's voice crack, low and desperate. But I didn't turn back. I didn't need to see him fall. I'd already won. Luca's breath was warm against my temple. You did it, Leora. My voice was hoarse. Not yet, but I'm free. And for the first time in my life, that was enough. The crunch of the snow under my boots felt like thunder in my bones as Luca, Callahan, and I walked away from the house I'd once called home. The mansion loomed behind us like a tombstone. Cold, beautiful, empty of anything worth staying for. I didn't look back. Not once. At the end of the drive, Callahan's battered SUV waited, its windows fogged from the heat inside. I slid into the back seat, my breath still coming in ragged gasps. My hands trembled on my knees. Luca climbed in beside me, his hand closing over mine, grounding me in a way that made the storm inside me settle. For a moment, at least. Callahan turned in the driver's seat, his eyes sharp and alive. You did good in there, kid. I let out a hollow laugh. Then why do I feel like I'm about to collapse? Because you've been holding yourself up for too damn long, Luca murmured. He squeezed my fingers. It's okay to let go. But I didn't. I couldn't. Not yet. Callahan pulled away from the estate, tires skidding on the ice. The gates closed behind us with a groan of rusted iron. And just like that, I was free. Really free. Or as free as someone like me could ever be. The sun rose higher, painting the snow in shades of gold and pink, but it didn't touch the chill that had settled deep in my bones. My father's voice still echoed in my head. You think you can stand above me? I made you. I clenched my fists. He was wrong, wasn't he? Luca turned to me, his eyes soft but unwavering. About what? About me. About what I am. Callahan snorted from the front seat. He was dead wrong. You're the best parts of him, twisted into something he can't control. That's why he hates you so much. I sat back, letting my head thump against the window. The trees blurred by, branches heavy with snow. The road ahead, endless and empty. Somewhere out there, the world was already tearing the Cavendish name apart. The headlines were just the start. Lawsuits. Investigations. People who'd once smiled at my father's table now scurrying like rats from a sinking ship. But even as the empire crumbled, I knew one thing. It wouldn't end here. Not really. There were too many people with too much to lose. And I was the spark that had started the fire. We drove for hours, stopping at a roadside diner long after the lunch rush had come and gone. I sat in a corner booth, picking at a plate of fries, while Callahan huddled over a steaming mug of coffee. Luca slid in beside me, close enough that our shoulders touched. You need to eat, he said. I'm trying. I pushed a fry around my plate. Everything tastes like ash. He reached over, plucking a fry and popping it in his mouth. Then let it. You'll get hungry again. I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to. Callahan's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it, then at me. You want the good news or the bad news first? I arched an eyebrow. There's good news. He cracked a grin. Yeah. The good news is your father's done. The accounts are frozen. The press is circling like sharks. He's trying to do damage control, but no one's buying it. And the bad? His smile faded. The people he protected, they're pissed. And some of them think the only way to bury the scandal is to bury you. Luca stiffened beside me. How close? Too close, Callahan said. I've got chatter that someone's already put a price on her head. My stomach twisted. So what, we run again? No, Luca said, his voice like steel. "No more running." I turned to him. "Then what do you suggest? We wait around until they find us?" He leaned in, his forehead nearly touching mine. "We hit back. We take the fight to them. They want to erase you? You make it impossible. You make yourself so loud, so visible, they can't touch you without the world watching." Callahan barked a laugh. "That's the spirit." I swallowed hard, my pulse thundering in my ears. "And how exactly do I do that?" He spread his hands. "You write it. You tell your story. You drag every last one of them into the light. Names, dates, deals. The press will eat it up. The world loves a fallen dynasty." I stared at the greasy tabletop, my reflection warped in the sheen of spilled coffee. My story. For so long, my words had been the only place I was free. Now they'd be my shield, my sword. I pushed my plate away and stood. "Then let's do it." We holed up in a cheap motel on the edge of the city. Callahan used burner phones to throw off any tales, while Luca kept watch by the window, his gun never far from his hand. I sat at the scratched-up desk, my notebook open, pen poised above the first blank page. My hands shook. The words clogged my throat. But then I remembered my father's voice, my mother's cold eyes, Alden's betrayal. I remembered the taste of fear, the suffocation of being told I'd never be enough. And I started to write. The first line came like a slap of cold water. "My name is Leora Cavendish, and this is the truth they never wanted you to hear." I wrote until my fingers cramped, until my eyes blurred with tears I refused to let fall. Luca made me drink water, made me eat cold pizza when my stomach threatened to cave in on itself. Callahan combed through every page, cross-checking dates and names, feeding me pieces of the puzzle I hadn't known I was missing. By dawn, the notebook was half full. By the next night, it was done. We sent it out in pieces, snippets to journalists who'd already ripped the Cavendish name to shreds, excerpts to bloggers who lived to burn the powerful. The rest we packaged up like a bomb, ready to detonate when the time was right. When the first story dropped, the world exploded all over again. The TV in the motel room blared with pundits shouting over each other. Talk shows dissected my words line by line. My mother's lawyer called my burner phone 13 times in one night before I smashed it in the bathroom sink. People called me a hero. Others called me a traitor. I didn't care. Let them call me whatever they wanted. At least they were saying my name for once. My name, not my father's. The threats came too. Thinly veiled warnings slipped under motel doors. Cars idling too long outside our room. Luca never slept more than an hour at a time. Callahan started carrying 2 guns instead of 1. One night I woke to find Luca sitting at the edge of my bed, his hand wrapped around mine. The shadows under his eyes made my heart ache. "Why are you still here?" I whispered. He looked at me like I'd just asked him if the sky was real. "Because you're here." I sat up, pressing my forehead to his. "I don't deserve you." He cupped my jaw, his thumb brushing my cheek. "You deserve the whole damn world, Leora. And I'm going to help you take it." I fell asleep with his heartbeat echoing in my ear, my nightmares chased away by the promise in his touch. We stayed on the move, hopping from motel to motel, cheap rental to cheap rental. Each day the storm grew, headlines multiplying like weeds. My family name rotted in real time, the empire I'd once been chained to dissolving into scandal and lawsuits. But freedom is a strange thing. It doesn't feel like you think it will. It's not just a door swinging open. It's the wind in your face when you realize the world outside is vast and terrifying and yours. One night, standing on a motel balcony with Luca's arm around my shoulders, I looked out at the city lights and felt it settle in my bones. He leaned in, his lips brushing my ear. "What now?" I smiled, the answer clear for the first time in my life. "Now we build something better." We left the city lights behind us that night. Luca drove while I curled against the window, my notebook pressed to my chest like a talisman. The last pages were filled with names I'd once feared, secrets that would bury the last loyalists still clinging to my father's broken empire. Callahan slept in the back seat, his snoring punctuated by the soft click of his gun when he shifted. Every now and then, I'd glance at Luca, the ghost of a smile tugging at his mouth as he kept one eye on the road and the other on me, like he needed to be sure I was still real. I was more real than I'd ever been. By dawn, we were miles from the city. The motel we found was a rundown place off a state highway. 2 stories. Neon sign half burnt out, vending machines, buzzing like angry hornets. I collapsed onto the lumpy bed, my coat still on, boots unlaced. I woke hours later to the sound of Callahan arguing with someone on the phone. "They're spooked," he was saying, his voice low and sharp. "Of course they are. She's made herself too big to kill quietly. They can't risk it now. But don't let your guard down. They'll come at her sideways." Luca caught my eye from across the room, his expression a mix of weariness and pride. He mouthed, "We're okay." But I didn't believe that. Not yet. Not until the last piece fell. "We spent days in that room," I wrote. Callahan made calls to people who owed him favors. Old contacts from his days chasing ghosts for the government. Luca took calls on burner phones, paced the parking lot in the cold, his eyes always on the shadows. Each night, we'd eat takeout on the floor. Pizza one night, greasy Chinese the next. Normal food in an abnormal life. On the 4th day, the email came. Callahan burst into the room, waving his phone like he'd just caught lightning. "They're ready. The last cash. Offshore accounts. Trust funds hidden under fake charities. Names, signatures, photos. Your father's final skeletons." I took the phone from him, my fingers trembling. There it was. Everything I'd ever suspected, in black and white. Not just the Cavendish accounts, but the people who'd helped him bury the truth for decades. Judges, lawyers, senators. Names I'd heard whispered behind marble walls when I was a child. Words I'd thought were bedtime stories told to scare me into silence. They were real, and they were mine now. Luca leaned over my shoulder, his breath warm on my neck. "You leak this. You're not just burning him down. You're burning down everything that ever protected him." I turned, my heart pounding. "Then we leak it," Callahan laughed. A deep, rumbling sound that made the room feel smaller. "God, kid, you're your grandfather's ghost." I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the cracked motel desk, the glow of my laptop painting my face in shades of blue and gray. Luca sat across from me, half asleep, but every time my fingers stilled on the keyboard, he'd murmur, "Keep going, Leora." So I did. I wrote the final lines, the final confession. They called me a failure, but this is what they feared all along, a daughter who didn't stay silent. By dawn, the files were scheduled to drop. Auto sent to journalists, watchdog groups, even law enforcement agencies who'd turned a blind eye for too long. When I clicked the final button, a tremor went through me, like the last chain around my ribs had finally cracked. I leaned back, my eyes burning. Luca slid his hand over mine, our fingers weaving together. "You did it." I wanted to believe him, but I knew the world wasn't that simple. Callahan was right behind us. "You just lit the match. Now you hold the line." We packed up what little we had left. Burner phones, Callahan's files, my battered notebook. The SUV pulled onto the highway just as the sun rose. Streaks of gold tearing through the fog like promises I didn't know how to keep yet. We drove to the safe house Callahan had arranged, a cabin hidden deep in a forest reserve, the kind of place only rangers and ghosts knew how to find. No neighbors, no cell service, just trees and wind and the distant hush of a river carving its way through the land. The cabin smelled of cedar and old wood smoke. There was a single bedroom, a fireplace that crackled and spat sparks when Luca fed it logs. I slept for 12 hours straight that first night, my dreams a jumble of marble halls and my father's roar dissolving into the hiss of rain. When I woke, Luca was there, sitting in an old armchair, eyes soft but watchful. He didn't say a word, just pulled me into his lap, my head tucked under his chin, his heartbeat steady under my palm. I stayed there until the world made sense again. Days passed. The headlines didn't stop. Each morning, Callahan would come in from the porch, a stack of papers tucked under his arm like a war trophy. Senators resigning. Judges indicted. Executives dragged out of glass towers in handcuffs. The Cavendish name was a punchline now. Late-night hosts tossing it around like it had no weight left at all. One morning, I found Luca chopping wood at the edge of the clearing. The air was crisp, snow crunching under my boots as I stood there, watching the way his breath rose like smoke with every swing. When he paused, I stepped forward, pressing my hand to his chest. "What happens when this is over?" I asked. He set the axe down, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his glove. "What do you want to happen?" I hesitated. The truth felt too big to say out loud. I don't know. I want it to matter. I want to build something better. Something that isn't just ashes. His eyes softened. Then we do that. Together. Together. The word felt like a promise I hadn't let myself believe in before. Callahan came out later, his breath fogging the glass of the cabin door. Pack up, he called. We're moving again. I frowned. Why? I thought we were safe here. He shook his head, a ghost of a grin tugging at his mouth. Safe? Kid, you're never safe when you're the one who burned the king's house down. But you're too visible now. Too big to kill quietly. So they'll come at you different. They'll smear you. They'll dig through your past, twist your story until you're the villain. I clenched my fists. Let him try. He laughed. That's my girl. We left the cabin that night. Another safe house. Another place where the walls felt closer than the trees outside. But something was different now. This wasn't hiding. This was strategy. One night, curled up beside Luca under a threadbare quilt, I whispered into the dark. Do you ever regret it? Regret what? Me. Us. Walking away from everything. He pressed his lips to my temple. Leora, you were never everything. They were. Now we are. I closed my eyes, letting the warmth of him seep into the cracks. He was right. We were everything now. The days bled into each other, a cycle of news updates, encrypted calls, whispered plans for what came next. I started writing again, not about my father or the Cavendish name, but about the girl I used to be. The girl who sat in the shadows of marble walls and wondered if she'd ever be enough. I wrote about her so I'd never forget her, so no one else would either. One morning, Callahan handed me an old, battered notebook. What's this? I asked. He shrugged. Your grandfather's. He wrote everything down. Every deal, every betrayal. He knew someday someone would need it. I flipped through the pages, the ink faded, but the words sharp as knives. It felt like holding a map back to the beginning, and forward to something I hadn't dared to dream of yet. Luca leaned over my shoulder, reading the words with me. What does it mean? I closed the notebook, my fingers brushing the worn leather cover. It means we're not done yet. He smiled. Good, because neither am I. The world outside kept turning, louder and uglier than ever. But inside that tiny hidden room, I felt it. My future, pulsing like a heartbeat, waiting for me to step into it. And this time, I wouldn't be stepping alone. The new safe house was an old cottage tucked behind a wall of pines on the far edge of a lake I'd never heard of. The road that led to it was barely wide enough for the SUV to pass, a single thread of cracked pavement swallowed by snowdrifts and silence. The lake was frozen solid, a sheet of glass that caught the moonlight at night and threw it back at the stars. I stood at the edge of the dock our first night there, Luca's coat draped over my shoulders, my breath coiling in the dark. I could see my reflection in the ice. Sharp eyes, chapped lips, a woman I barely recognized but knew better than anyone ever had before. She stared back at me with something like defiance. Callahan's boots crunched behind me. He came up beside me, his shoulders hunched against the cold. In his hand, he held my grandfather's old notebook, the leather cracked, the pages brittle with time and secrets. You really think it'll help? I asked, not taking my eyes off the moonlit ice. He flipped the book open with a flick of his thumb. It's more than help. It's leverage. Proof of every handshake deal they made in the dark. Your father built his empire on this. And your grandfather? He kept every receipt. A small, humorless laugh escaped me. Guess the old man and I had more in common than I thought. Callahan's breath curled around his next words. You ready to use it? I turned to him. What happens when I do? He shrugged. You'll be the final nail. The one thing they can't spin or bury. They'll have to answer for it. On paper, in court, in front of people who used to bow to your family name. Inside the cottage, Luca was pacing the tiny living room, his phone pressed to his ear. He was talking to a contact of Callahan's. Someone who could make the next wave of releases stick. who could tie my father's oldest loyalists to the bribes and blood money they'd used to protect themselves for decades. When he saw me come in, he ended the call and crossed to me in 3 strides. He touched my cheek, his fingers rough but warm. "You good?" I leaned into his hand. "Good enough." The next few days blurred into a pattern I knew by heart now. Cold mornings spent poring over the notebook. Nights spent drafting statements, collecting every piece of evidence we could turn into a blade sharp enough to cut through the last of the lies. Luca slept on the sofa beside the fireplace, one eye open, his gun within arm's reach. One night I woke to find him sitting at the foot of my bed. The shadows under his eyes looked deeper than ever. He didn't say anything when I sat up, just reached for my hand, lacing his fingers through mine like he could keep me anchored to the world just by touching me. "Talk to me," I whispered. His thumb traced circles on my wrist. "I keep thinking about the first night I met you. How small you looked, sitting at that dinner table while they tore you apart." "Not so small now," I said, forcing a smile. "No." He leaned closer, his breath brushing my lips. "Now you're the storm they thought they'd tamed." The words wrapped around me like armor. I fell asleep that night, curled against his chest, the sound of the wind rattling the cottage walls like a promise I refused to let break me. When the final drop came, it was almost too quiet. Callahan sat at the rickety kitchen table, his laptop open, the files queued up like dominoes. The sun hadn't even broken the horizon when he hit send, but the world was already awake, waiting for another piece of the empire to fall. Within hours, the news was everywhere. My father's oldest allies, their backroom deals, the fund that had kept the wrong people quiet for decades. My grandfather's notebook laid it bare, a time capsule of corruption, a lifeline for everyone who'd ever wondered how far the rot went. I watched it all from the couch, Luca's arm draped around my shoulders, his fingers tapping a steady rhythm on my arm. The TV flickered with images of people I'd grown up calling uncle, godfather, friend. One by one, they were dragged into the light, their carefully curated facades cracking under the weight of the truth. "They'll come for you harder now," Callahan said, not looking up from his phone. Luca's voice rumbled through his chest. "They've already tried." I swallowed, my mouth dry. "Let them come." That night we packed our bags again, not to run but to move, to stay ahead of the people who thought they could still find a way to bury me before the dust settled. We drove through the night, the cottage fading behind us like a dream I didn't want to wake from. We ended up in a cheap rental on the edge of a town so small it didn't even have a name on the map. The place smelled of stale cigarettes and damp wood. I didn't care. It was enough. Luca bolted the doors, propped a chair under the handle. Callahan sprawled on the couch, snoring within minutes. I sat cross-legged on the floor, my notebook open in my lap. This time, the pages weren't about the past. They were about what came next. "You're not done yet," Luca said, crouching beside me. I shook my head. "No, this was never just about tearing them down. It's about what I build after." He brushed my hair back, his hand warm against my neck. "Then let's build it." I leaned forward, pressing my forehead to his. "Together?" "Always." The next morning, Callahan sat me down, with a cup of stale coffee and an old notebook of his own. "You want to stay alive? You make yourself too big to touch. You tell your story on your terms. Every interview, every word. You keep the spotlight on you, so they can't make you disappear." I stared at him over the rim of my mug. "Isn't that what we've been doing?" He shook his head. "No, kid. You've been dropping bombs. Now you stand in the crater and tell the world why you lit the fuse." So I did. The first interview was over the phone, a nervous reporter from a podcast who could barely get my name out without stumbling. I spoke slowly, carefully, every word a blade I knew would cut deep. I told them about the dinners, the parties, the hush money passed under the table while I sat at the edge, pretending not to exist. The next was on camera. Lucas sat just off screen, his eyes locked on mine the whole time. When my voice cracked, he lifted his hand, his fingers brushing the air like he could steady me from across the room. More interviews followed. Journalists, bloggers, people who hated my father, and people who'd once worshipped him. They all wanted the same thing, my truth. And I gave it to them. Every jagged edge. Every bitter taste. One night, after a live broadcast that ran longer than anyone expected, Luca found me in the tiny bathroom, My hands braced on the sink, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "Hey," he said, his voice low and steady. "Look at me." I did. The woman in the mirror looked exhausted, but her eyes burned. "You're winning," he said. I swallowed hard. "Then why does it still feel like I'm losing?" His hands closed over mine. "Because they want you to believe you are. But you're not. You're showing every girl who ever sat where you did that they don't have to stay there." The weight of that settled on my shoulders. Heavy, unbearable, beautiful. When we climbed into bed that night, he wrapped himself around me like a shield. And for the first time since I'd walked out of that dinner, I let myself believe he could keep the worst of the world away. If only for a while. The next morning, I opened my notebook again. This time, the first line came easy. What they feared most wasn't my silence breaking. It was me learning how loud my voice could be. We stayed in that nameless town for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of cheap coffee, borrowed laptops, burner phones that we snapped in half after every call. 3 weeks of Luca propping a chair under the door handle every night while I fell asleep listening to the wind rattle the loose window panes. 3 weeks of Callahan drifting in and out, always with a new piece of information to keep the fire burning. And every day, the world kept turning. Headlines, court dates, people who'd once laughed at my father's jokes now turning on each other like jackals, fighting over the last scraps. My name was on every screen, my words dissected, debated, twisted. Some called me brave. Some called me a traitor. Some said I'd brought shame to a good family. They didn't know what that family looked like behind locked doors. Each night, I wrote until my eyes burned. I wrote about the girl I'd been, the woman I was becoming, the world I refused to let bury me. Luca read every word, his thumb tracing the ink smudges on the pages like they were scars he'd promised to protect. One night, I woke to the sound of his voice. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, his phone pressed to his ear, his hand clamped around mine like an anchor. His jaw was tight, eyes sharp as glass. "No," he said. "If they want to come, let them. But they won't get near her. Not while I'm breathing." When he hung up, I touched his arm. "Who was it?" "Callahan's friend in the city. Says your father's old guard is getting desperate. They're putting out stories, trying to paint you as unhinged, greedy, ungrateful." I laughed, the sound scraping my throat raw. "Let them talk." He turned to me, his eyes softening. "I know you're strong, Leora, but you don't have to carry all of this alone." I cupped his face, brushing my thumb over the line of his jaw. "I'm not. Not anymore." He kissed me then, slow and deep, like he needed to remind himself I was real. I fell asleep with his breath on my skin, the sound of my name on his lips. The next morning, Callahan burst through the door, his boots tracking mud across the cheap carpet. "They're moving assets. Offshore accounts, secret trusts. What's left of them anyway? They're hoping they can outrun the fire you started." I pushed my hair out of my face. "So what do we do?" He dropped a folder on the table. "We follow the money, and we choke it off." I spent hours combing through old account numbers, paper trails my father thought he'd buried decades ago. Each number was another piece of the puzzle, another chain I was learning how to break. Luca sat beside me, cross-referencing names, his fingers tapping out a steady rhythm that kept my mind from spiraling. When I found the final connection, an account tied to a foundation in Switzerland, I let out a laugh that turned into a sob halfway through. Luca caught my face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears I didn't even realize had fallen. Hey, look at me, you did it." I shook my head. "Not yet, but I will." We set the plan in motion that night. Callahan made the calls, pulling strings that stretched across oceans. The foundation's board was filled with old men who'd once toasted my father's brilliance over champagne and whispered about the girl he couldn't quite tame. Now they'd watch everything they'd hidden rot in the light. The next morning, the news broke. Another headline, another crack in the walls they'd built around themselves. I sat on the edge of the motel bed, my phone buzzing with messages from journalists, old classmates, people who'd once pretended not to see me at parties. I turned the phone off and tossed it onto the nightstand. I didn't need to hear what they thought anymore. Luca sat beside me, his knee brushing mine. What are you thinking? I stared at my reflection in the dusty mirror across the room. That maybe he was right about one thing, I was always going to break away. He just didn't know how big the crack would get. Callahan chuckled from his place by the window. You're the crack and the wrecking ball, kid. We stayed another week, long enough to watch the fallout ripple through every boardroom, every back room, every country club that had once rolled out the red carpet for my family's name. Long enough for the threats to change shape, from violence to lawsuits to whispers about burying me under so much paper I'd never breathe free air again. But I'd tasted freedom. I knew what it smelled like now. Cold pine, gun oil, the warmth of Luca's breath against my ear as he promised me we'd never run again. One night, sitting cross-legged on the floor with Callahan's maps spread out around us, I asked, what if we're wrong? What if we're just making ourselves targets for nothing? Luca's hand closed over mine. We're not wrong. And you're not alone, Callahan grinned, tapping the notebook with the butt of his pen. You've already done more than your grandfather ever could. He kept the secrets. You're the one tearing them down. The next day, Callahan handed me a small, battered envelope. Inside was a single key. What's this? I asked. He shrugged. A door. One more thing your grandfather left behind. A place he kept ready in case the world ever tried to eat him alive? Or you. Luca turned the key over in his palm. Where? Out west. Small town. No one knows about it. No paper trail, no cameras. I closed my hand around the key. It felt heavy. Final. Are you telling me to run? Callahan shook his head. I'm telling you to survive. We packed that night. Luca kept watch while I stuffed my notebooks into my bag, every page a promise that I'd never let them silence me again. We left the motel before dawn, the neon sign flickering behind us like the last ghost of a life I was finally done with. We drove west for 2 days, stopping only for gas and coffee that tasted like rust and old dreams. Callahan took the lead, his old truck a battered shadow on the road ahead of us. Luca drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting on my knee, his thumb tracing circles that steadied the tremor I didn't want him to see. The safe house was a cabin tucked into a valley where the mountains pressed close enough to swallow you whole. The porch sagged. The windows rattled. But inside, it smelled like cedar and something older. Something that felt like home in a way my father's marble halls never had. We settled in. Luca nailed boards over the windows, his breath fogging in the cold. Callahan made calls from the corner of the kitchen, his voice a low growl as he kept the lines of our last stand alive. I sat at the old wooden table, my notebook open, pen tapping against the page. For the first time in weeks, the words didn't come. They hovered just out of reach, buried under the weight of everything I'd already said. Luca came up behind me, his hands warm on my shoulders. What are you trying to write? I leaned back against him. What comes next? He kissed the top of my head. Whatever it is, we face it together. I looked up at him, at the man who'd stood at my back when the world tried to break me. The man who'd become the place I ran to instead of from. Together. Always together. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft as whispers against the roof. Inside, I pressed my pen to the page and wrote the first line. When the storm comes, remember, I am the storm. And for the first time, I knew I wasn't writing an ending. I was writing the beginning of everything. The snow fell for 3 days straight, burying the world outside our little cabin in a silence so deep it felt like the earth itself had stopped to listen. The drifts piled against the porch, covered the battered old truck Callahan kept hidden in the shed, turned the crooked fence around the property into a ghostly outline beneath a blanket of white. Inside, the fire burned day and night, crackling in the hearth while Luca moved through the cabin like a shadow stitched to my side. He checked the locks every hour, kept the shotgun propped by the door. Callahan was restless, pacing the floor in worn socks, the last of my grandfather's notes spread out on the kitchen table like holy scripture. I sat by the window with my notebook in my lap, watching the wind carve shapes into the snowbanks. The words came slowly now, each one harder than the last, but they still came. I wrote about what came after the storm, the quiet that waits on the other side of every scream, the freedom I hadn't believed in until I'd bled for it. Sometimes I'd wake in the middle of the night to find Luca watching me, his eyes soft in the glow of the dying fire. He'd pull me into his arms without a word, his warmth wrapping around me like armor I hadn't known I needed. We'd lie there listening to the snow tap at the windows, his heartbeat steady against my back. It should have felt like an ending, but it didn't. It felt like the world holding its breath, waiting for whatever came next. On the fourth morning, Callahan pushed open the front door, letting in a gust of freezing air and the scent of pine so sharp it made my eyes water. He stomped snow off his boots and dropped a crumpled newspaper in my lap. "Front page," he said, his grin wide and toothy. "Your father's empire is dust. Offshore accounts seized. Final indictments in motion. They're clawing at each other like rats in a sinking ship." I smoothed the paper flat, my fingers tracing the bold headline. My father's face was there, frozen in a grainy photo outside a courthouse, his eyes hollow, his mouth twisted around words that would never hold power over me again. "Does he know I'm still alive?" I asked quietly. Callahan's grin softened. "He knows, and it's killing him." Luca sat beside me, his hand warm on the back of my neck. "Good. We burned the paper that night, watched the flames lick at the ink until my father's face curled into ash. I stood at the hearth long after the last embers died, the echo of his voice finally silent in my head. "You know," Callahan said, his voice low behind me, "this is the part they never prepare you for." I turned to him. "What part?" He shrugged. "The part after you win. The part where you have to decide what living looks like when you're not fighting to breathe anymore." I looked at Luca, at the man who'd stood between me and the storm more times than I could count. His eyes met mine, steady and sure. "I think we figure it out together," I said, and we did. In the weeks that followed, we dug our way out of the snowdrifts. We rebuilt the fence, chopped enough wood to last until the first thaw. Callahan left for a while. Old debts to collect. Old friends to warn that the Cavendish name wouldn't protect them anymore. Luca and I stayed. We cooked over the old stove, read the news out loud to each other when the radio signal was strong enough to catch. At night, I wrote. Not about my father or the empire that had crumbled under its own rot, but about the small things. How the wind sounded when it moved through the trees. How Luca's laugh felt against my chest when he buried his face in my neck. One evening, I found him standing by the lake, the ice still thick enough to hold his weight. He turned when he heard me coming, his breath a cloud in the twilight. "You ever think about leaving?" I asked. "Sometimes," he said. He reached for my hand, his gloved fingers wrapping around mine. "But not without you." I smiled, the cold stinging my cheeks. Good answer. When spring came, it did so slowly, like the world was afraid to wake up all at once. The snow melted into muddy rivulets that carried away the last footprints of the people we'd been that winter. The lake thawed. The trees budded. Callahan came back, his grin wide as ever, his coat heavier with new secrets. He brought news with him. My father's sentencing date. The final sign that I'd done what they all said I couldn't. Luca asked that night as we sat by the fire, the envelope with the court date resting between us on the coffee table. I stared at it, my chest tight. I don't know. What would I say? Luca's voice was gentle. Whatever you need to say. When the day came, we drove back to the city together. It felt like walking into the belly of an old nightmare. The courthouse steps were crowded with cameras and reporters, people shouting my name, begging for a soundbite, a glance, a sign that I was still that same broken girl who'd stood on the edge of her father's kingdom. But I wasn't. I climbed those steps with Luca at my side, Callahan a silent wall behind us. Inside, the courtroom was cold and bright, the smell of disinfectant and old wood filling my nose. My father sat at the defendant's table, his hands folded, his suit rumpled like he'd slept in it. He looked up when I walked in, and for the first time in my life, I saw him flinch. I sat in the front row, my notebook pressed to my chest, my heartbeat steady. When they asked me if I wanted to speak, I stood. "My name is Leora Cavendish," I said, my voice carrying to the farthest corners of the marble hall. "And for years I believed every lie you told me. I believed I was small. I believed I was your failure. But you were wrong." I turned to look at him, letting him see every piece of me he'd tried to bury. "You didn't make me, you broke me. But I built myself back stronger than you could ever understand." He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The gavel fell, and the world he'd clung to for decades crumbled for the last time. When we stepped back into the sun, the reporters surged forward. Questions flew like arrows. But I held Luca's hand tight and kept walking. I didn't need their stories anymore. I had my own. Back at the cabin, I burned the last of my old notebooks, the pages curling into ash that drifted up into the clear spring sky. In their place, I started new ones, blank pages waiting for a life I hadn't dared to dream about until now. One night, lying in the grass by the lake, Luca traced his fingers over my ribs, the faint scars, the places where old bruises had once bloomed like flowers. "You ever think about what you'd say to her?" he asked. "The girl you used to be?" I closed my eyes, the breeze cool on my skin. I'd tell her to stand up sooner, to run sooner. But I'd also tell her this. She was never a failure. She was the storm they never saw coming. He kissed me then, slow and deep, the taste of tomorrow warm on his tongue. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.